Welcome back to another episode of Profits on Purpose, the nonprofit accounting podcast, and not just from one accountant's perspective. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler. With me, as always, is Mark Palardy.
Hey, everyone.
And got a great show for you this week. We have an article that we'll discuss about nonprofit job titles. Do they matter? What do you go for? How should you title your employees or your nonprofit staff's title? Does it matter even? Well, we'll talk about it, and I'm sure we have some thoughts to share on it. And then we have another article, which is Remote Technology in the Pandemic, Rebalancing Towards Equity and Access, how you can leverage in-person or digital kind of marketing and communication tools and delivering services in a hybrid way. What do you pick? Do you pick digital? Do you pick in person? We'll talk about the pros and cons of both and kind of our take on this article. And then our question for the week actually is overcoming racial equity fatigue, how DEI kind of programs and initiatives have strained either somebody that's thinking that they're not working fast enough or they're working too fast. We'll talk about kind of the nuances of that and what we have to say about it, but I'm sure it'll be a rousing discussion, and we welcome your feedback. Anyway, Mark, you have our first article for us this week. Take it away.
Hey, thanks, AJ. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Happy holidays if you're watching this on YouTube. Hey, even happy holidays if you're listening to us on the podcast. Today's first article is from Katie Appold from Nonprofit Hub called Nonprofit Job Titles, What to Go For. This is an interesting article. So the premise of this article is that nonprofits want to create these unique and interesting title names for people as they hire on. And sometimes these titles are great and sometimes not so great. So what should we be thinking about when we're creating some titles for job descriptions for nonprofit? Make them meaningful, right? Titles don't pay the bills. So if you have trendy titles like Director of Philanthropy or VP of Engagement, they sound lofty, but they're often quite ambiguous. So you got to realize that you're appealing to people outside of an organization too, who are going to need to understand what your title is and what you actually do. They should represent what you do and who you serve. And, you can see in some nonprofits that they'll offer a premium title, whether it's a VP role or some other title that sounds really great, to offset less market wages. But, nobody's fooling anybody, because once you actually find out what the job description is of those people, it's often not what one would expect from that job title. So another tip is to make those titles memorable. So be authentic with your job titles. When it accurately reflects on what you actually do, then people will remember it. Simple titles like Director of Development or something like that really gets down to, well, this is what this person does. Whereas some of these other ones, people are left scratching their head, like an engagement architect or a dialogue curator. These are all real titles, folks. And what the heck does a dialogue curator do? If you have to try to figure it out, it's not a super helpful title, even though it sounds fancy. I don't know. Have your title be readable, right? Less is more. And this one, have I seen this one? So, the Senior Director of Community Engagement and Client Experience, it's like, whoa, that's a mouthful. And even people, when you ask them what their title is, they often don't remember because it's 8 or 9 words long. And while it might give some information, it's certainly not readable and it's often not memorable. So this article suggests avoiding the word and just keeping it to 3 or 4 words max, right? I don't think you need more than that. And you don't necessarily need hierarchical references or numerical references, senior, junior, all these sorts of things. I mean, there are specific known titles, right? Senior accountant might be appropriate because that's an understood title in the larger world of accounting. But, senior development, junior director two, whatever. I mean, I'm just throwing a spitball here, but it's got to be helpful and it's got to be memorable. So, that was the takeaway from this article. I think it brought up some good points, but AJ, I'm sure you have some opinions on this as well.
Oh boy, do I ever. So, job titles. I think so. Where do I start? I'm doing some hiring myself, and what I'm finding is that job titles often don't reflect what somebody actually does. And I think you do a person a real disservice if you give them a lofty title. But let's use like marketing as an example, right? If they're director of social media, or they are chief marketing officer or something like that in an organization. Clearly defining what somebody does, I think, as opposed to just giving them a lofty job title, will serve them much better. I don't think you do anybody a service by giving them a lofty job title when all they're doing is like using the director of marketing, say, if all they're doing is maintaining a donor database. I think you would be much better served as, like being like, a development team member or something like that. Because I think the job title needs to match what they're doing. Here, we'll use another example from the for-profit world, a controller. Well, a controller can mean many different things, and I think it depends on the size of the organization you're working at. We can use controller in a nonprofit setting as well, right? If you're a controller, say, at a small nonprofit that does 2 programs, and you're the only person in the accounting staff, you're not just a controller, you're doing APAR, you're kind of just the accountant there. And if you're managing the day-to-day accounting operations of the organization, I doubt you have much time left in your day to be able to do controller type things, report on budgets, to put together a pro forma forecast of cash flows, or to structure new budgets for programs. You're really just essentially a full service bookkeeper at that point. And I think you do people a disservice if they think they're at that level and they say leave to apply to another job, or you have like an audit come in and they're really pressing at what this controller does as far as like the control piece or the planning of the organization, and it's a hard crash to reality when they realize that their job title doesn't really reflect what they're doing in their job. So I think one thing that the article didn't mention was being able to, you know, describe and give somebody a nice title, but for that to match the kind of work that they're doing. It's very nice to be known as the director of or senior something, but I think you're doing that person a disservice if their work that they're doing doesn't match the title that they're given. So I think aligning those two things is not only going to keep your organization or the people in your organization, I guess, laser focused on what they're doing, but it also doesn't give them the false sense that they're doing more than what they're doing. So, and doesn't give them reason to think that they are more than what they are. I don't want that to sound harsh, because I think somebody in a position could work their way up, say from being a full service bookkeeper or an AR and AP clerk to being a controller at some point. But there needs to be the incremental steps and learning that happen along the way, and people underneath them to relieve them of the jobs that they were previously doing to earn or to learn those other positions. So although I think job titles are very important, and I agree with the author to keep them, short, distinct, and so everybody knows what the heck you're doing, but I think it needs to match, your boots on the ground and the work that you're doing day in and day out. And you do a disservice to your organization and your employees if you're tagging somebody with a title that is higher than what they're actually doing, or kind of states that they're doing more than what they are, or vice versa. You see if somebody's really is a controller and you have them listed as like a senior accountant, that's doing a disservice to them in the opposite way, where you're really underselling what they're doing. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but it's something that I see all the time, is that I guess people's job titles kind of overinflates or underinflates what they're doing.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on this one. And I think it's not just the companies, right? I've seen situations where people are beefing up their resumes, so they're giving themselves a promotion on a resume. But if you check references, well, they weren't really the controller, right? They were the senior accountant or the full charge bookkeeper, or whatever a role is. And when you start to question somebody, when you're interviewing them and you ask them some of the tough questions and they can't answer, or they don't have any experience with anything that a controller would do, it starts to become clear real fast that either they're lying or the company they're working for, as AJ said, is doing them a disservice. So, I think the author makes great points about being honest when you're giving your titles, but I would say also the employees need to be honest about owning those titles, right? Because there's no getting around with what your skill level is. And while you may even fool somebody in a job interview and get hired, we've all had situations at jobs where, somebody gets hired at a certain level and you're like, wow, they really have no clue what they're doing. And they're kind of faking their way through it until they're found out. And that's a recipe for disaster all around, because it takes time and money and all that to train somebody, only to have them really just disappoint you. So anyway, AJ, on that depressing note, let's throw it to you for article number 2.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Our next article comes our way from Nonprofit Quarterly, and it's called Remote Technology in the Pandemic and Rebalancing Toward Equity and Access. So the title's a mouthful, and essentially what the article is about, and I think it's really well written, and we'll link it down in the description, or you can Google it if you're listening to this, just the audio version. But essentially, Arizona State University, I'll leave my feelings about ASU out. I went to Arizona, but that's all right. But anyway, they did a research project on how the pandemic and the shift to kind of remote technology has impacted philanthropy. And what they found was interesting, and the article really digs into it. And they said, there's the one hand, right, where it promotes access. You now have much more access to involvement via, if you live across the country and you want to help somebody in Detroit, let's say you live in, Arizona, and you want to help somebody in Detroit. It's very easy now to be able to do that because of this like pandemic acceleration of technology and people being remote. And so I think, in-person engagement is great, but you can also get that from a Zoom call or, a Google Meets or something like that now. So the engagement part of that is really important. And you see a big uptick in that kind of area. And reaching younger volunteers. We all know millennials and beyond are, married to their phones, their computers, and technology. And to be frank, nonprofits were lacking in kind of that social digital outreach that happens in, the metaverse or whatever it is. So they're saying that this is an acceleration. If nonprofit has a TikTok that goes viral, I think of like the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge that went viral. These can all be great accelerators in this new kind of digital remote world that we're living in. On the other hand, remote technologies can reinforce inequalities. And what they talk about is failing to engage those people. It has left people behind that maybe don't have access to internet or the socioeconomic divide of actually engaging those people that used to be, what in sales is called hand-to-hand combat, but in, like person-to-person outreach is very difficult if somebody doesn't have the technology to reach those people. And there's a digital divide sometimes, especially if we're talking about a socioeconomic status gap where the very poor among us doesn't have access to high-speed internet or internet at all, or they're limited to internet access at, like, say, school or a coffee shop that they can't afford at home. So, and you can't provide those resources if you're digital to somebody that doesn't have a digital access point to those people. The other part they talk about is English as a second language. America more and more is becoming a multi-language country. I mean, I can see it just in my own lifetime. I grew up in Arizona, and in Arizona, everybody at least spoke a little bit of conversational Spanish. And when you would move around the country, you would kind of lose that. No, everybody would just speak English. And I think as we're moving forward in the country, you see more and more people speaking multiple languages. It was amazing to me to move to Oregon and find people that were Anglo and speaking Spanish fluently because they were taught in school and it was the second language and it was conversed in. So, you need to think about that when you're setting up your digital outreach and your organization's, remote functions, is to serve people that maybe English is not their first language and have something available to them. And often that's lacking, and Google Translate can only go so far for you. So I think keeping that in mind when you're delivering these services is really crucial. So, and then the big theme, I guess, is that, essentially the pandemic forced technology adoption at a real breakneck speed. And, I think we're now picking up the pieces of where it fell short. And I think a hybrid model, at least the author, kind of says a hybrid model going forward is probably going to be the most beneficial, and not just relying either canning the digital or canning the in-person kind of outreach. I think you're going to, the research suggests that if you take a hybrid approach, that's the way forward. So, Mark, I'm sure you have some things to say about this. I thought it was a really interesting article and really thought-provoking from initial read of the title.
Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. I think, necessity is the mother of all invention, right? I think this was the direction society was headed in regardless, but, we get a pandemic that happens on our doorstep, and nonprofits, as we've discussed in multiple other podcasts, have to make do with what they've got. And they've got to create these digital platforms in order to even just continue to exist. So, I think the benefits, they're clear. And, as the population ages, younger people are going to be coming more and more into the fold. And your millennial and younger, who are the digital generation, really the digital natives, really are going to need to have that experience so that they can participate in a digital level. I think on the other end of the spectrum, which you might have mentioned, AJ, but I want to touch on a little deeper, are folks who are aging, who don't have as much connection with the digital sphere. And a lot of people, right, in nonprofit land, your volunteer base is often made up of the older generation, because they're the ones who have the time and, the bandwidth to actually help and volunteer. And if they don't feel comfortable with technology, they don't feel comfortable on Zoom calls or, reaching out to people via electronic methods, you're going to be in a world of hurt, because you're going to have to be finding volunteers who actually can feel comfortable with that technology. And there's also the social interaction, right? A lot of older people volunteer not just to give to an organization, but to also participate in something that's meaningful and gives back. And it's often their social outlet into society, right? They go and they help at the food bank so that they can interact with other people and be doing something good for society at the same time. If you're doing everything behind a digital screen, many of the people who were elderly that I spoke to in the pandemic felt lonely and isolated, because everything seemed to have moved online, and they missed human physical interaction with other people, other volunteers, their friends, etc. And I think moving everything to a digital platform, especially for those who are comfortable and used to working in person, has its pitfalls. So, I think the article and AJ, you nailed it, where it's like, it's going to have to be a hybrid model, at least for a while, because until the digital natives, if you will, grow to a stage where they're, now the older generation, you're going to have this juxtaposition of people who are comfortable with technology and people who are maybe not as comfortable. So I think there's an interplay, and it's probably a good thing. We've talked in the past about how fundraisers, right, taking them completely online certainly helps you reach a wider audience, certainly helps you, spread your fundraising to more people than you could hold in a ballroom. But you miss that interaction. You miss that kind of that slow, let's present a program, let's have a meal, let's do a paddle raise. These are things that tend to work better when you're in person and you can actually connect with people eye to eye and feel the energy of a room. I'm sorry, there's just not the energy in a Zoom room as there is if you're in a ballroom and people are excited and you're seeing the stakeholders who are affected and helped by your donations. There's a real palpable energy that raises that up. And that I have not gotten that yet much as they try from a Zoom meeting. So I think a hybrid approach and maybe doing a little of each every year is going to be the way going forward.
Yeah, and I think, Mark, you bring up a good point about, like human interaction. I mean, listen, I was an early adopter of the internet. I've been on a computer since, the late 80s. But I am not a fan of, like, say, online learning. I really like to be in person, to be even if you're able to ask questions in an online kind of forum. I really value that person-to-person interaction for learning. We've had to adapt over the pandemic, and I think the same thing is true with these philanthropic kind of, especially from a donor's perspective, but from a service, from people providing or delivering services. There's just no substitute for person-to-person interaction. And I think, you're much better served to use that hybrid model, like the author suggested, to be able to bridge that gap on both sides of the divide. People that prefer an online, or a digital kind of touch point versus an in-person one, you're much better served to do, to cover both sides of that divide than you are to just forge one path, and stick with it. So I think, the pandemic has brought around, like that digital transformation that was going to happen anyway. It was just at a greater pace than it was before. But don't be fooled. It was going that way anyway. And I think what it did was it really put the emphasis on going digital or going remote with services and fundraising, and that digital divide really widened for somebody that wasn't ready for that. So making sure that your organization is set up, and to bring up the equity part, making sure that you can reach those people that don't have the access that many of us do, and to realize that those underprivileged are the ones that probably need it the most. And so making sure that you have a strategy to reach those people, either volunteers or people that you're providing services to, or people that would be good candidates for your organization. I mean, that's huge. You don't want to miss out on those great people that maybe don't have the access to be able to participate in a digital world and be able to raise, rising tides raises all boats. So make sure that you're including those people in your plans as a nonprofit. And I think everybody benefits. So yeah, Mark, do you have our discussion topic this week?
I do. We have a bit of a meaty one this week, which is why we're only doing 2 articles. And I think this is an important topic. It's called, the question is titled Racial Equity Fatigue, and this person needs advice. They say they work at a mid-sized nonprofit, about 150 employees. In the past year, they have been implementing or attempting to implement racial equality programs. Within the organization, they keep talking over and over again how important it is to fight racism, but it's really just feeling all like lip service. Nothing is changing, and I'm getting frustrated. I have real concerns that racial equity fatigue is setting in across our organizations. What can I do? So, I want to just point out the obvious for our listeners. You might not know this, but AJ and I are both 2 white dudes. So we are answering this question, and we both did our own research, because I think it's an important topic to bring up. I think it's a really important discussion to have, because a lot of people are talking about this, and how does it specifically relate to nonprofits? And even though we are, 2 white dudes running a podcast, we both recognize the importance of this topic, and we don't want to have it be off limits just because we don't have anybody particularly on the show today who can speak from that racial inclusion perspective. But hopefully we give it good shrift. And if you have comments, we really do welcome them, because we want to have this kind of a thing be an ongoing discussion. And any feedback that you have in the YouTube channel or on our Twitter at Profitless Pod, we certainly welcome it, because, there certainly are perspectives that we're not taking into account here. But, I think we have a good basis and foundation. AJ, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think the thing to recognize is that, like, change is happening, and I think the fatigue on this, because in my professional experience, we've been hearing about DEI or diversity, inclusion, and or diversity, equity, and inclusion training for. I've seen it really be mainstream in the nonprofit sphere for the last like 5 to 6 years. Not that this work wasn't important and happening before, but you're talking about a real ramp up in this kind of work and this kind of like bringing this to the forefront in organizations and wanting this work to wanting, like the organizations to not only like consider diversity, equity, and inclusion, but take steps to make their organizations more diverse, more inclusive, and be more equitable to not only the programs that they're delivering, but the way that the organization is run and the people within it. So I think it's something that's happening, and I think the fatigue around it is, especially like in the nonprofit sphere, is that DEI has been on the table for 5 to 6 years really hard. And I think people come from one or two camps in this. I don't want to call it a debate because I don't think there's a debate about it anymore. I think they come from one or two camps when they're talking about this kind of fatigue of it. The first camp being is like, we've put so much money and effort and into this and things aren't changing fast enough. Or the other side of that coin is, wow, we've put a lot of time and effort into this and things are changing so fast, I don't know how to cope. So I think it's important to address both sides of those of that divide to understand where people are coming from. And I would start with the change is happening, but it's not happening fast enough, and we've put a lot of money into this. I think we need to acknowledge that just throwing money at a problem or stating that there is a problem doesn't solve the problem. And the other thing to point out is that change is difficult for anything. I mean, think about like if you ever had to change a process within an organization. Let's talk about an accounting process or a management process or a expense reimbursement process. How nails on a chalkboard, that change sounds like, and everybody's always like, it was easier the way before. I don't know why we're changing this. There's a reason why it's happening, but to understand that like change is difficult and change is slow, I think helps kind of understand that like this isn't an overnight success kind of story. And I think this kind of change takes time. And if you're seeing any kind of movement, I think it is good movement. The other side of that coin where things are moving too fast, I think comes from maybe like a naive perspective that things weren't as bad as they were, or they don't need as much change. And to understand that like change is coming and it needs, and I guess everybody needs to be on board with it, and understand why it's happening. I've personally been in like DEI discussions in like a CPE, and all they did was talk about, I guess, the importance of DEI, but they never got to the core of what the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion means, or the process in which this needs to happen. And so I think for those people, that are maybe thinking things are happening too fast, to share the metrics or to somehow codify what's going on, and to make them not feel like they're being attacked on this side, that their job or their placement is in jeopardy because of an initiative. I think, bringing everybody into the fold is much easier, and working together, to build something together is much better than drawing a hard line in the sand and saying one side is wrong or one side is right. So just wanted to put that out there. Mark, I know you have more feelings on this, but I think realistically, like I want the audience to know there's really two sides to this discussion, and it's not always just, not enough has been done or not too much has been done, and a balance in between that. It's a pendulum here, and it's swinging back and forth, I think, in the way things are.
Yeah, and AJ, I actually want to point out that I think there's even a third side, which probably, you can file under the things are going too fast. And those, because I have worked with somebody like this in the recent past, those who think there is no problem at all, that races are equal, and why do we keep bringing this up? And that racism is something that used to exist but doesn't really exist anymore, and why do we keep having these discussions? Like, I'm not racist, so clearly there's no problem here. And I've run into this where people don't want to even have the DEI discussion because they don't see it as an issue, right? And 99% of the time, that's because they are coming from a socioeconomic and racial background where it's not a problem for them because they are in the power position. So they're not necessarily interested in making any changes. So any change is going to be a change that's too fast. So I think I just want to point that out because you're fighting against, people who don't even see that the problem exists. And I think your point about the slow change should be underlined and bolded and italicized because, frankly, in the history of this country, it has been a long, 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 slow reckoning since the time of slavery. And there's a lot of people waking up to the fact, even recently, even in the past year or so, especially with George Floyd, that should have woken up a long time ago. But, the 1960s were not that long ago where there was true racism that was extolled and out in the open and accepted and just the status quo, and nobody thought any different of it. And now, it's at least seen as something that's anathema and something we should be aware of. But as we try to push towards some equity and some inclusion, I can absolutely understand why those who are affected negatively by racism, which I would suggest we all are, but anyone from a minority group who's affected by racism negatively really, really is tired and wants this thing to just be done, right? Wants people to wake up and start treating them as equal. And when people don't even understand that systemic racism is a thing, that they don't understand that our society is built on structures that were founded based on some racist beliefs, it's a difficult discussion to have. And within workplaces, I think I found this article, and I think you and I shared it, AJ, but from the Stanford Social Innovation Review that's talking specifically about racial equity fatigue. And one of the really interesting parts that I read in there, which I thought was an interesting nugget, if you will, was how they talked about how at an organization there was a older white man leading the charge for racial inclusion and equity. And people were like, well, you can't be leading the charge. You're a white guy. You're part of the problem. And the response is, well, of course I can be leading the charge, because who are they more likely to listen to if we have this systemic racism problem to begin with, right? If it's somebody who's in a power position by the very nature of this problem itself, they're more apt to listen to that white guy and maybe have these second thoughts about it, as opposed to somebody who is of a minority class that they're systemically not listening to anyway. So, these are things, you don't necessarily want the white man leading the charge, but if whoever can affect change and whoever is in here should be listened to, because this is something, that is a problem that is long time coming, and it's going to take a long time to fix. It's not going to happen overnight. It certainly has had its recent sunshine, and anytime anything gets sunshine, people want a fix immediately, but that's just kind of not how society works.
Yeah, and I think I might also mention that I think the spotlight on this topic and the fact that it's brought to light, trust me, I've seen lots of money thrown at like bad projects or like kind of stuff. So not all DEI work is moving the needle forward, and I think you need to recognize that. Everybody needs to recognize that like resources and effort need to be put into things that move it forward. And I think moving forward together, whatever side you're on regarding like the fatigue portion of this, I think moving forward together, you get more accomplished. And I think especially in like the nonprofit sphere, I really think that the heightened awareness of this, of DEI training and implementation, it's not just internally in an organization, and this goes for the for-profit world too, right? It's not only internally trying to make everything more diverse and equitable and inclusive, but it also then trickles down and comes out the other end for services provided. So if you're a nonprofit, you probably have seen a shift in wanting to help those underserved communities, wanting to help those people on the other side of the socioeconomic divide. And I think that's even probably more of an important metrics, the socioeconomic one, because I think that affects everybody equally. If you're poor, you got it shitty all the way around, for lack of a better word, and we can dive into the racial disparities, on how on the makeup of the socioeconomic divide. But I think starting there is probably the easiest hurdle to get over. I think for somebody that maybe is an opponent of this work. But I think seeing those programs and services from a nonprofit perspective be angled more at those that really deserve the services is only not good. And I think moving forward together on this is really the way to go. And I think, again, I don't know all the answers, and this is still an evolving subject that I'm learning on, and I think if everybody took that approach and not just kind of dig in their heels, look, we're at a point where I think everybody's they've made up their mind on how they feel about this kind of stuff, and they're no longer learning, they're no longer listening, in some instances, and they're really just kind of curmudgeon about either side of this. And I think that's where the change really breaks down, and what makes it difficult for these things to be implemented is when people stop working together and they're either team A or team B on how they feel about this. And so I think, for any kind of change to be made, everybody has to work together on this and understand, like, it's happening, and how is the best way that this all can be implemented, I think is really the way to get to it. And I think asking questions is probably the best way to get there, in my opinion. Like, if you feel like your organization is throwing a lot of money at this and you don't see any change, ask to see the metrics and ask to see why, what's the plan to, like, not just throw money at this, but have results come of it. And I will say that a lot of the organizations that I work with have seen positive change in the last 6 to 10 years on this issue. And, a lot of the grants that I see coming out from state and federal and local foundations are all geared towards being more equitable in how they're dispersing their dollars and making sure that it reaches the people that need it the most.
Yeah, AJ, I want to just piggyback on something you said about some of these DEI programs that don't work. And I think going back to our questioner who talked about lip service, that can be really frustrating, right? You can kind of get a sense in your organization, are they just ticking the box, right? Are they just having this program existing so that they can say to their board members or to their, organization, oh yeah, we really care about this, so here we have this program in place, tick the box, but nothing really ever changes. And I think your suggestion of, so show us some metrics. And again, this is going to happen over time. This isn't necessarily going to happen immediately. Like, what is your change in the last 6 months in this regard? This change might be slow, but I think it's super important to hold people to account. And, if you are a donor out there, I think it's important that you ask the questions too, if this is something important to you. Obviously, we don't want to get into a situation where everybody's divided off into their camps and this is good and this is bad, and then I'm not giving to this organization because they support, diversity and equity, and inclusion. It's, we've come into such a polarizing world. And I think AJ's notion of coming together and trying to work on this, it's tricky when you have people who don't even recognize it as a problem. But frankly, sometimes we have to work on things even when people don't recognize them as problems. So, we do the best we can. I think we want to keep this dialogue open, and revisit this. I know it's a tricky topic and everybody has an opinion about this. Clearly, my opinion probably shows through pretty brightly, but I think it's important to keep having the discussion and not to just bury our heads in the sand and think, well, this issue that's happened since George Floyd's murder last year, it's dying down now, and we can just forget about this. This has ramped up the movement of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I think there's going to be change. I think one of the things this article said is the youth in society is way, way, way more interested in this than the older generation, and as such, the older generation is eventually going to die off, and as the youth comes and grows up and becomes a part of the society that are the big donors and are the big people contributing to society, this is going to change just by its very nature of an aging population who doesn't believe in this dying off. So, it's happening whether you want it to or not. It's just a matter of how much patience can you have in the process, and how do you act in your own world to move the process along while not pushing against society as a whole.
Yeah, I think great points, Mark. And I think one other thing to just put out there, and one thing that I've learned over the years, I'm a 90s kid, and I guess what is still shocking to me is that there is still a divide, right? I mean, the 90s were kind of, everything's great. And so it is shocking to know that there are still inequalities out there, and there's still unconscious bias, and there's still bias out there. And I think it's surprising to everybody. I would just say that I think if you're on either side of this divide, on the DEI kind of fatigue kind of thing, I think to recognize that change is happening, and it's probably not as bad or as great as you think it is. It's probably somewhere, there's two sides to a story, and it probably lies somewhere in the middle. Whether it's skewed one way or the other is debatable, but I don't think it's as great or as awful as people sometimes make it out to be. And I think we're moving closer to a center point where, we're getting to a place where I think it's moving in the right direction. And I want to just harken back on, like, change takes time. And I think any kind of change, especially a change like this, it's going to take time. And I would say, look back at the change that has been made over the last 40 years. I think that's a huge, 40, 50 years. I think it's a monumental shift in the way people think and the way things are distributed. And I think going forward, it's only going to move more towards the center of being something that I think we can all get behind. And so I think, it's important to address these. And I think we are at a point where for the last 6 to 10 years, this has really been a hot button topic that's been pushed really, really hard. And to understand that, people are going to get fatigued about this, and realize that questioning and understand and, asking questions and being able to critically think about things, I think, is vital. And trying to see things from somebody else's perspective is vital. We work as consultants for accounting, and always trying to see the end user's kind of perspective on things is really important to us. And I think that's true in life. I think you need to see it from another person's perspective, and hear what they had to say to be able to take it in and understand what's going on. And that happens on both sides of this debate. And so I think, realizing that, I think, will take everybody a long way.
Right. Well, I think that'll put a bow on this discussion. We certainly, again, welcome your feedback and appreciate the question coming in. Brought up some juicy topics for discussion, and your feedback can be given to us again on the YouTube channel or at Profitless Pod. That's going to wrap up our show for today. On behalf of AJ Wheeler and myself, we certainly appreciate you being here, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everybody.